Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for a video which will appear in two separate playlists here on the channel. Number one being the short story discussion playlist, but number two being a story-by-story read-along for Dubliners by James Joyce. This is the 13th of 15 videos in that playlist. Now, today's video will have a summary section where we summarize the short story called So What Happened, a lit crit portion, and a writer's corner portion of this video. So, what happened? Mr. Hoppy Holohan, head of the Victory to Ireland Society, has been busy trying to arrange concerts, but in the end, it was Mrs. Carney who got most of the things done, herself a bright young woman who married an older man because a serious man would wear better than a romantic person, whatever that happens to mean. And they are raising their daughters as we would probably recognize in an upper middle class family. They have money to go on vacations every year. They are sending their children to fancier schools, etc. And Mrs. Carney's daughter will play music for the concerts. 8 shillings per night, don't you know? But the first night goes poorly. Though the second night goes better, there are rumors that they will cancel the third of 4 shows. And Mrs. Carney begins to insist that that will not change the pay. Mr. Fitzpatrick assures her that it will not. Still, she tells her husband, and he says he will come with her to the Saturday show. That show comes, and Mrs. Carney can't get a straight answer on her daughter's pay. So she raises a stink until Mr. Fitzpatrick gives her half the pay and says she will get the rest of the pay after intermission. But at intermission, she is told that the rest of the money will be approved at the meeting on Tuesday. That's still 3 days away. Mrs. Carney tells her husband to fetch a cab, and they leave. Now, the big hullabaloo for this short story will be who is in the right. But that is going to come down to what you believe with the number 2 point in the lit crit portion. But that's not where I want to start. Where I want to start is with this quote from the short story. Mrs. Carney was somewhat reassured, but she thought well to tell her husband part of her suspicions. He listened carefully and said that perhaps it would be better if he went with her on Saturday night. She agreed. She respected her husband the same way she respected the General Post Office, as something large, secure, and fixed. And though she knew the small number of his talents, she appreciated his abstract value as a male. So, for me, what this quote does is it gets into male disposability. There is in this short story the specter of sexism raised, as Mrs. Carney believes her daughter would be getting paid if she were a man. But we have no reason really to believe that, do we? That paradigm is not set up in this short story. Mrs. Carney's daughter is the only performer that we know of that is actually getting paid. As far as I can tell, we don't know the rates that everyone is being paid. Maybe I missed that. And we don't know that no one... So if she is the only one not getting her full pay, there are other female performers getting their full pay. But this idea from Mrs. Carney that she respects her husband sort of as an institution. We read earlier in the short story that she married her husband because he was a sensible person who would wear better than a romantic type, herself being the romantic type, herself being idyllic, or at least so she told herself, meaning that she married her husband for stability. She earlier in the short story, we learn that she was a very promising young woman, and she had a number of suitors, but none of them were quite suitable. But what does that mean? What is it that suitable means to Mrs. Carney? It seems that being suitable means you're earning enough money that she can have her fancies on the side, that she can pursue her passions on the side. That seems to be what this means to Mrs. Carney. Basically stating that the only the only value her husband presents in her life is stability as it pertains to being predictably bringing home money. That seems to be the sexist bent in this short story, not that which is presented by Mrs. Carney. Now, on page 106 of this collection, Mr. Holohan and Mr. O'Madden Burke came into the room. In a moment, Mr. Holohan perceived the hush. He went over to Mrs. Carney and spoke with her earnestly. While they were speaking, the noise in the hall grew louder. Mr. Holohan became very red and excited. He spoke volubly, but Mrs. Carney said curtly at intervals, "She won't go on. She must get her 8 guineas." So here's the thing with this. They are performing in a concert for the Victory to Ireland Association or Society. Are you about the money or the cause? These people are nationalists who are trying to raise money and awareness for Irish nationalism. Are you here for the cause, or are you here for money? And this sort of runs into part 3 here that we get on the kissing page to this. As soon as the first part was ended, Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Holohan went over to Mrs. Carney and told her that the other 4 guineas would be paid after the committee meeting on the following Tuesday, and that, in case her daughter did not play for the second part, the committee would consider the contract broken and would pay nothing. "I haven't seen any committee," said Mrs. Carney angrily. "My daughter has her contract. She will get £4.8 into her hand, or a foot she won't put on that platform." "I'm surprised at you, Mrs. Carney," said Mr. Holohan. "I never thought you would treat us this way." "And what way did you treat me?" asked Mrs. Carney. So, just very briefly there, she asks, "What way did you treat me?" But it's not her being slighted out of any money. It is her daughter. She is taking this very, very selfishly. Her daughter is never consulted as to whether her daughter is here for the performance pay or for the actual ideas at play. And this will lead a little bit into number 4, but I think we need to stick here for a moment. What is the value of experience versus the value of the pay involved? After all, it costs her daughter nothing to perform. Now, maybe it costs them money to get there, and that is part of what they are factoring in. Maybe. But did her daughter pay for them all to go to the show, or did she? Because she's arguing for her daughter's money. Now, What is these things are so closely interlinked. The money or the cause, and and experience versus pay. Now, because it does not cost her daughter anything to perform, she's not really out any money for performing. So here's in situations like this, and I have been in situations like this, the thing that comes up to me is just do the work and never work with those people again. That's what dignity is. Having dignity means, yes, it's a screw job. They are doing the screwing, you do the job. And afterwards, you know, and so do they, that you are the better person. That's dignity. So dignity sort of sucks, right? Dignity means that you sometimes get the short end of the stick. And that's just how it works. Dignity means in these situations where someone has to lose, you lose and you do it with grace. There is always someone to lose. If you have been set up to lose, you lose, and you just know in the future, Mr. Hallahan will need someone to play the piano, and it will not be me. And when he comes to me, my revenge will be saying, oh no, uh, remember last time you did not pay me. So I'm afraid I cannot do this again. Unless, to Miss Carney, Mrs. Carney's daughter, unless to her, Irish nationalism really is the thing at play. There will come in your life, if you are so lucky, something that is worth more to you than money. Now, for many people, what that ends up being is family. For many people, that ends up being, for example, their children. If your child comes to you and says, Mom, Dad, I want to play football this year, and you look at them and you say, okay, what's in it for me? That is the wrong answer. The reason so much of this trouble in this short story breaks out is that Mr. Hallahan, Mr. O'Madden Burke, Mr. Fitzpatrick, or Mr. Hallahan. Did I say O'Hallahan? Mr. Hallahan. That's such a hard name for me, and I don't know why. To these people, this society is the same thing as their children. They are seeing this movement towards a national Ireland as something worth sacrificing for. Your child comes to you and says, I want to play football this year, and that's your sacrifice now. The kid gets to play football. He's sacrificing time, probably a few brain cells. I was a football player, I understand. But the sacrifice is yours. Sure, you get to see your child play football, etc. It's not the same as your life experiences as the child playing the football game. To Mr. Hallahan, to Mr. O'Madden Burke, to Mr. Fitzpatrick, they don't understand when Mrs. Carney is coming to them begging, or not begging, insisting on this money. To them, the money is secondary to the cause. Yeah, if we'll give it to you if you have it. They saw that agreement not as much as binding as it was, look, we're going to do this for you when we can do it. Mrs. Carney sees this as her child over the movement. This is my child's money. Your movement is secondary. But let's get into point number 4 here. It's not about her child. Mrs. Carney was a romantic who married a practical man and then had romantic ambitions for her daughter. Romantic ambitions for her, not romance, but romantic, the ideals, the artists involved, artistes, as it is in the short story. Mrs. Carney is a romantic who married for practical reasons and then has romantic ambitions for her daughter, who then may have, but when the practical part of that, the money involved, the money is practical. When the practical part of that romantic ambition does not come through, she may have ruined any artistic / romantic future for her daughter. All of these people here, Mr. O'Madden Burke, Mr. Holohan, Mr. Fitzpatrick, they swear off of this entire family after this. Mrs. Carney, for the right or for the wrong? Mrs. Carney, for the right or for the wrong, threw a heavenly fit, threw an apocalyptic rage over her daughter not getting that pay. And everyone that saw it says, okay, I'm not doing this again. Well, that might not be a big deal for Mrs. Carney. Mrs. Carney's day of playing the piano might be over. Mrs. Carney has had her go. Mrs. Carney's daughter is just starting out in life. So, what is it that Mrs. Carney has accomplished in this short story? So look, this idea of who's in the right, oftentimes it doesn't matter. Who can lose, right? So there is in the motivational circles something that is very, in my opinion, extremely profound. And what it says is it's not about right or wrong. If someone else negatively impacted your life, that sucks. But it has to be your responsibility to fix it. Your spouse cheats on you, divorces you, and now you have half of your stuff and you don't trust anyone. That sucks. Your spouse isn't coming back to fix it. It's your responsibility to fix it. Your father was abusive. That sucks. That's awful. That's terrible. That's miserable. He's not going to fix it. When your life is worse off because your father was abusive, you are the one who suffers, not him. The best revenge to an abusive father would be to lead a successful life. What Mrs. Carney is doing here is cutting off her nose to spite her face. And is cutting off her daughter's nose to spite her daughter's face as well. And that sucks, right? This whole situation, it's not great. But who stands to lose? Who stands to lose? Now on to Writer's Corner. We have this quote in this short story, and it's something that we find often in James Joyce, which is kind of, I hate to say it this way, because James Joyce is one of the greats, but it's lazy, because James Joyce absolutely has the tools to do this better. While Mr. Holohan was entertaining the freeman, Mrs. Carney was speaking so animatedly to her husband that he had to ask her to lower her voice. That's telling. Show us this. Show us Mr. Hallahan in the corner talking to the free man. And he keeps hearing something and looking over, hearing something and looking over. And it's Mrs. Carney. Then you give us Mrs. Carney yelling with her husband. And her husband has to say, look, honey, shut up, will you? Right? Give us the actual scene, because the actual scene gives us so much more than... the actual scene gives us so much more than simply telling us these things happened. If you show Mrs. Carney getting so animated, it gives your reader something to do rather than just read a couple sentences. It gives you, the writer, the opportunity to build up this character of Mrs. Carney. If you show us Mr. Hallahan, while Mrs. Carney is doing this, maybe if you zoom in on those two, Mr. Hallahan and the free man, you get to give a little bit of dialogue that tells us how little it is that Mr. Hallahan understands Mrs. Carney. And then you have was entertaining the Freeman man, right? So this guy from a publication, you can have Hallahan saying something negative about Mrs. Carney to the Freeman. And at that point, this situation for Mrs. Carney's daughter just got bigger, right? Because now there's someone from the outside of this little shindig who also is distrustful of Mrs. Carney. And here's the last thing I want to say. This is something that James Joyce does right so often. This is literature, not propaganda. This is literature, not propaganda. James Joyce does not insist upon you which of these parties is correct. James Joyce does not insist upon you that Mrs. Carney, valuing her daughter and kind of her own dreams through her daughter, is more important than some piddly nationalist movement. James Joyce does not insist upon you that the national movement is way more important than this girl playing the piano, and she should understand that and sacrifice her time for the national movement. James Joyce doesn't tell you either of those things. James Joyce doesn't insist upon you either of those ideals. James Joyce presents a situation and paints the picture as clearly as he can from the middle. You are left to make of it what you will. You are left to take from this short story and craft your argument as to why this XYZ is more important than ABC. So the real when you think of it this way, Mr. Hallahan, Mr. O'Madden, Burke, Mr. Fitzpatrick, these people are making arguments for the youth of Ireland. The nationalistic movement is so the children in Ireland can grow up in their own country, and someday they will be the ruling class of this nationalistic Ireland. Mrs. Carney is making the argument for her upper middle class daughter. They're both making an argument for the same generation. Should the argument be individualistic, my daughter needs her pay, or communal? Your daughter can sacrifice 4 evenings of her little life to play the piano that we can further this cause for her entire generation. All of these things are going on in this short story, and James Joyce does not take the time to tell us which of these ideas he thinks is correct. That is art, not propaganda. That's all I have for this episode. A video which will appear in 2 separate playlists on the channel. Number 1 being the short story discussion playlist. Number 2 being the Dubliners playlist, where this will be video 13 of 15. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here on the channel, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, consider hitting the subscribe button in order to stick around for more literature. There's poetry every Monday. There's a short story read-along with the Finca Vigia edition by Ernest Hemingway right now. There is obviously this short story read-along. We're reading through all of Sylvia Plath's poetry as well. And hey, lots of stuff going on the channel. I hope to have you back for the next video.